I'm Sarah Mitchell, a 55-year-old retired factory worker who once shared a life with Michael Bennett, my ex-husband who built a $50 million real estate empire after we parted ways. My daughter sat at the will reading with a smug smile, certain I'd get nothing from her father's $50 million estate. But when the lawyer read one single sentence, everything changed. The smile vanished from Emily's face, and she started screaming so loudly the office walls shook. You're listening to this story on Renvenge Zinnia, where buried truths are told by those who live them. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you're listening from in the comments. The coffee mug slipped from my fingers, shattering on the tile floor as Mrs. Thompson's voice pierced through the thin apartment wall. Your damn sprinklers are flooding my roses again, Sarah. I grabbed a dish towel, kneeling amid the ceramic shards. At 55, I was still cleaning up messes that weren't entirely my fault. The automatic sprinkler system I'd installed last month had a loose joint, sending water cascading over the property line every few days. I'd tried explaining the repair schedule to my neighbor, but patience wasn't Linda Thompson's strong suit. The phone rang. I ignored it, focusing on mopping up the spreading coffee puddle. The answering machine would catch it, but the ringing persisted, cutting through Linda's continued shouting next door, something about property values and inconsiderate tenants. On the fifth ring, I stood, tossing the soaked towel into the sink. Sarah Mitchell speaking. Ms. Mitchell, this is Rachel Carter from Carter & Associates in Toronto. The woman's voice carried that careful, professional tone I'd learned to recognize over the years, the kind that preceded bad news. I'm calling regarding Michael James Bennett. My hand tightened around the receiver. Nobody had called Michael by his full name in my presence for 14 years. What about him? Ma'am, I'm very sorry to inform you that Mr. Bennett passed away on Wednesday evening. The funeral service is scheduled for this Saturday at 3 p.m. at Maple Grove Chapel in Mississauga. The words hit like a physical blow. I sank into the kitchen chair, its familiar creak suddenly too loud in the silence that followed. Wednesday evening. That was 2 days ago. 2 days while I'd been worrying about sprinklers and coffee stains. Ms. Mitchell, are you there? Yes, I'm here. My voice sounded strange, distant. How did you get my number? Your name was listed in Mr. Bennett's personal effects as an emergency contact. I understand you were previously married. Previously married. 20 years reduced to a legal footnote. Yes. We divorced in 2011. The words came automatically, muscle memory from countless forms over the years. I see. Well, there will be a reading of the will following the service. You're named as a beneficiary, so your presence would be appreciated. Beneficiary? The word felt foreign, impossible. Michael had built his empire after our divorce, transforming the small real estate firm he'd started during our marriage into something I barely recognized from news articles. What could he possibly have left me? Ms. Mitchell, will you be attending? Through the kitchen window, I could see Linda Thompson examining her waterlogged roses, hands on hips in that stance that meant another confrontation was brewing. But her complaints seemed to come from another world now, muffled and insignificant. The chapel, I said slowly. Which one did you say? Maple Grove Chapel on Dixie Road. The service begins at 3 o'clock, followed by a brief reception. The will reading is scheduled for 5:30 at our offices downtown. I found myself nodding, though she couldn't see me. I'll be there. After hanging up, I remained in the chair, staring at the phone as if it might ring again and deliver different news. The coffee stains on the floor had begun to set, dark rings that would need scrubbing, but I couldn't move. Couldn't process the simple fact that Michael, vibrant, stubborn, impossible Michael, was gone. The afternoon light slanted through the kitchen window, illuminating dust motes that danced like memories I'd tried so hard to forget. As I sat there, the name Michael James Bennett echoed in my mind, each syllable pulling me backward through time until I was standing in a cozy Toronto diner on a rainy April evening in 1990, watching a man in a navy coat argue with the manager about his hiring practices. "You're telling me you won't consider women for weekend shifts because they can't handle the rush? That's the most ridiculous thing I've heard all week." I stopped mid-bite of my poutine, fork suspended halfway to my mouth. The man turned slightly and I could see his profile. Sharp cheekbones, determined jaw, dark hair catching the fluorescent light. He was magnificent in his anger, and I found myself hoping the manager would keep arguing just so I could listen to him tear his logic apart. "Sir, I didn't mean any offense." "Of course, you didn't mean offense. You just meant to discriminate." He pulled a business card from his coat, sliding it across the counter. "When you change your mind about hiring based on qualifications rather than outdated assumptions, call me." The door chimes jingled as he left, and the diner felt smaller somehow, drained of electricity. I watched through the window as he climbed into a black Ford, noting how he checked his mirrors twice before pulling into traffic. Careful, methodical, but not afraid to fight for what was right. "That guy's trouble," the manager muttered loud enough for the whole place to hear. I stood up, leaving a $10 bill next to my half-eaten poutine. "No," I said, surprising myself with my certainty. "That guy's extraordinary." The business card lay abandoned on the counter. Michael Bennett, real estate consultant. I memorized the phone number before stepping into the April rain. It took me 3 days to work up the courage to call. When I finally did, he answered on the second ring with a brisk, "Michael Bennett." "This is Sarah Mitchell. We haven't met, but I saw you at Rosie's Diner on Monday night." A pause. "The woman with the poutine who defended my honor to the manager." "You heard that?" I was grabbing my umbrella from the car. "You left a good tip, too." I could hear the smile in his voice. "So, Sarah Mitchell, what can I do for you? Have dinner with me somewhere better than Rosie's?" Another pause, longer this time. "Are you asking me on a date or do you need real estate advice?" "Definitely a date. Though if you have any tips on convincing handsome men to have dinner with strangers, I could use the consultation." He laughed, a real laugh, not the polite sound men sometimes made when women tried to be charming. "Friday night, the Lakeview on Queen Street, 7:30. He wore the same navy coat to dinner, but underneath was a suit that made my pulse race. We talked for 3 hours about everything except business. His childhood in Mississauga, my job at the textile factory, our shared love of old Canadian films and new novels. When he laughed at my story about accidentally flooding my apartment while trying to fix a leaky faucet, I knew I was falling. 6 months later, I proposed in that same diner, sliding a ring across the counter where he'd left his business card. "Marry me, Michael Bennett. Make me the luckiest woman in Ontario." He said yes before I'd finished asking. Our wedding day blazed with October sunshine, the kind of perfect weather that makes promises feel possible. Michael wore his grandfather's suit, tailored to fit his frame, and carried wildflowers we'd picked that morning. My hands shook as I slipped the ring onto his finger. "Forever," he whispered, and I believed him completely. Emily arrived a year later, a squalling, red-faced miracle who transformed our quiet house into something alive with purpose. I remember standing in the hospital room, watching Michael cradle our daughter with the same fierce determination he brought to everything, and thinking this perfect moment was all I'd ever need. But even then, holding that perfect baby, I noticed how Michael's eyes occasionally drifted to the business magazine someone had left on the nightstand. As Emily grew from toddler to schoolgirl, I began to notice things I'd missed in those first blissful years. When she turned 6, Michael bought her a computer, not a toy, but a real machine worth more than my monthly salary. "She needs to understand technology," he explained, watching her navigate programs I'd never heard of. "The future belongs to kids who think digitally." I suggested teaching her to bake cookies instead. He laughed, but not kindly. We'd moved by then to a house on Lakeshore Boulevard with 3 bathrooms and a kitchen bigger than our old apartment. Michael's real estate firm had landed a contract with a major developer, and suddenly we had money for things I'd never imagined needing. A housekeeper came twice a week. Our fridge dispensed filtered water. Emily's bedroom looked like a toy store. "Isn't this wonderful?" Michael asked one evening, gesturing at our new dining room with its chandelier and table for 10. "We can finally entertain properly." I missed our old kitchen table, scarred from Emily's coloring projects and our late-night talks. The new table reflected light like a mirror, demanding coasters and placemats. The entertaining started almost immediately. Business associates, potential clients, other successful couples whose conversations revolved around property values and investment strategies. I'd wear my best dress and try to contribute, but discussions about commercial real estate and corporate deals left me feeling like I was speaking a foreign language badly. "Sarah works at the textile factory," Michael would explain when someone asked, and I heard something new in his voice. Not pride, but an apologetic edge, as if my job required an excuse. Emily thrived in this new world. At 8, she could discuss software with Michael's tech-savvy clients. At 10, she was critiquing the wine choices at restaurants I couldn't afford on my own. At 12, she rolled her eyes when I suggested family picnics. She preferred Michael's business conferences in Vancouver and Calgary. "Mom doesn't get it," became her favorite phrase, usually delivered with an exasperated sigh of someone far too sophisticated for mundane concerns. The first real fight came on Emily's 13th birthday. Michael had planned a party that looked more like a corporate networking event. Catered food, hired entertainment, a guest list full of business contacts, and their kids. I'd wanted something simpler, maybe a barbecue in our backyard with her school friends. "This is embarrassing," I told him the night before, watching servers arrange elaborate floral displays. "She's 13, not 40. "She's growing up in a different world than we did, Sarah." He adjusted a centerpiece with the same precision he brought to contract negotiations. "These connections matter. These relationships will shape her future." "What about just being a kid?" He turned to face me fully, and for a moment I saw something cold in his eyes. Calculation where there used to be warmth. Being just a kid is a luxury we can't afford to give her. The world is competitive. Either we prepare her to win, or we prepare her to lose. I thought about my own 13th birthday, a picnic with my mom, a homemade cake, gifts wrapped in reused wrapping paper. It had been perfect in its simplicity. The party was a success by Michael's standards. Emily charmed the adults, mingled with their kids, received gifts that spoke of serious money, smartphones, designer clothes, a bike worth more than some cars. But I caught her once standing alone by the patio, looking lost amid the sophisticated celebration. "You okay, sweetie?" I asked. She straightened quickly, slipping back into the persona Michael had helped her craft. Of course. Why wouldn't I be? But for a moment, I'd seen the confused little girl underneath all that premature sophistication, and it broke my heart. That party marked the beginning of the end, though I didn't recognize it then. What followed were 9 years of slow-motion disaster, like watching a landslide from the bottom of a hill, inevitable, destructive, unstoppable. Michael's business consumed more of his time, attention, and soul. Weekend family dinners became conference calls. Vacation plans got canceled for client emergencies. Emily's school events competed with board meetings, and the meetings always won. "You don't understand the pressure I'm under," he'd say when I complained about missing another of Emily's dance recitals. "This business supports our lifestyle." But I understood pressure, the kind that came from keeping a factory running, ensuring hundreds of workers had jobs. The difference was my pressure served something larger than myself. By the time Emily graduated high school, she'd become a stranger to me. Michael had groomed her into his perfect protege, sharp, ambitious, dismissive of anything that didn't advance her prospects. When I suggested she consider vocational school alongside college applications, she looked at me like I'd suggested she join a commune. "Mom, that's exactly the kind of thinking holding you back," she said, 15 and already talking like a real estate consultant. "You settled for mediocrity. I won't make that mistake." The words hit like physical blows. Settled for mediocrity, as if 20 years of keeping a factory running meant nothing, as if being a steady, present mother was somehow shameful. College made everything worse. Emily chose business school, Michael's alma mater, naturally, and came home for holidays full of theories about market trends and personal branding. She looked at our house, our life, our values with barely concealed contempt. "You could do more, Mom," she'd say, as if my contentment was a personal failing. "Dad started with nothing and built an empire. You've had the same job for 15 years. "Some things matter more than money," I'd reply, but she'd already stopped listening. The final explosion came during her senior year. Michael had been working 80-hour weeks on a massive development deal. I'd been handling everything at home, grocery shopping, laundry, the mundane tasks that kept life running. When he missed Emily's graduation because of a client crisis, I finally said what had been building for years. "This is enough, Michael. Family has to come first sometimes." He stood in our kitchen, that granite shrine to success, still in his suit at midnight, checking emails on his phone. "Don't you dare lecture me about priorities. Everything we have, everything Emily's accomplished, exists because of my work." "What about everything we've lost?" "Like what?" He finally looked up from his phone, genuinely puzzled. "Like us. Like being a family instead of a corporation." He stared at me for a long moment, and I saw my answer in his eyes before he spoke. We weren't a family anymore. We were a business arrangement that had outlived its usefulness. "Maybe it's time we stopped pretending this is working," he said quietly. The divorce took 5 months. Michael's lawyers were efficient, professional, devastating. I got the old starter home on Eglinton Avenue, which he'd kept as rental property, and enough money to live modestly. He got everything else, including Emily's unquestioned loyalty. "You're holding me back too," Emily told me during one of our last conversations before she moved to Vancouver to work for Michael's company. "All this guilt about family values and simple living, it's toxic, Mom. I can't be around that negativity anymore." I sat alone in my empty house afterward, surrounded by boxes of memories from a life that apparently meant nothing to the people I'd loved most. Now, 14 years later, the afternoon light was fading outside my apartment window. My coffee had grown cold, the ceramic shards still scattered on the floor. Somewhere across town, funeral preparations were underway for the man who'd once promised me forever, and I had no idea why he'd remembered my name in his will. The 2 days between Rachel Carter's call and the funeral passed in a strange, suspended state. I cleaned my apartment twice, pressed my one good dress, and rehearsed conversations that would never happen. Each morning I considered not going, but each evening found me still committed to paying my respects, whatever the cost. Saturday morning arrived gray and cold, typical March weather in Ontario. I stood before my bathroom mirror, adjusting a scarf I hadn't worn in 4 years, wondering what Michael would think of the woman I'd become. The reflection showed someone older than I felt inside. Gray hair where brown used to be, lines mapping the geography of quiet disappointments. The drive to Maple Grove Chapel took 25 minutes through neighborhoods that told the story of Toronto's economic divide. My modest apartment complex gave way to middle-class subdivisions, then to the manicured lawns and stone facades where Michael's circle lived. The chapel sat on a hill overlooking Mississauga, its modern architecture suggesting permanence and prosperity. Cars lined the circular drive, Lexuses, Audis, a few Teslas probably worth more than my best year's salary. I parked my 12-year-old Honda between a BMW and a Mercedes, feeling like an intruder at someone else's event. The chapel's interior whispered money. Mahogany pews, stained glass windows, flowers arranged with artistic precision. At least 150 people filled the space, their conversations a low hum of respectful mourning mixed with business networking. I recognized some faces from the business dinners Michael had dragged me to during our married years, but most were strangers from the life he'd built after me. I slipped into a back pew, hoping to remain invisible until the service ended, but whispers followed my arrival like ripples in still water. A woman in an expensive black dress nudged her companion, pointing discreetly in my direction. I caught fragments of conversation. His ex-wife. Can you believe she showed up after what she put him through? The stories had taken on a life of their own over the years. Apparently, in this version, I was the villain who'd held back a brilliant man, the anchor that nearly drowned his ambitions. I'd learned long ago not to fight narratives that served other people's need for simple explanations. Mom. The voice cut through the chapel's murmur like a blade. I looked up to see Emily striding down the aisle, her face a mask of disbelief and barely controlled anger. At 32, she'd inherited Michael's sharp features and commanding presence, dressed in a black dress that probably cost more than my monthly rent. Success radiated from her like heat from pavement. Expensive watch, perfect haircut, the confident posture of someone who'd never doubted her place in the world. What are you doing here? Her voice carried across the chapel, turning heads and silencing conversations. I stood slowly, meeting her gaze. I came to pay my respects. You lost that right 14 years ago. She moved closer, close enough that I could smell her perfume, something sophisticated and assertive. He wouldn't want you here. Maybe not, but I needed to be here. For what? To ease your conscience? To play the grieving widow for people who know exactly what kind of wife you were? The chapel had gone completely quiet now, 150 pairs of eyes focused on our confrontation, like spectators at a hockey game. I felt the familiar weight of judgment, the same pressure that had suffocated me during those final years of our marriage. But this time, something was different. This time, I had nothing left to lose. I'm not here to cause trouble, Emily. I'll sit in the back. I won't speak to anyone. You'll leave now. Her voice rose another notch, drawing murmurs of approval from the crowd. You embarrassed him enough when he was alive. Don't make it worse by pretending to grieve his death. I remained standing, holding her stare. Around us, the chapel buzzed with anticipation. Someone coughed. A cell phone vibrated against wood. Before I could respond, Emily turned to address the gathered mourners, her voice carrying the practiced authority of someone accustomed to commanding rooms. I apologize for this disruption during what should be a time of remembrance. She gestured toward me with the casual dismissal of someone swatting a fly. My mother seems to have forgotten that divorce means you're no longer family. A few people nodded. Someone whispered agreement. I felt heat rising in my cheeks, but forced myself to stay calm. For those who don't know, Emily continued, warming to her theme, this is Sarah Mitchell, the woman who spent 20 years holding back one of the most brilliant men this city has ever produced. While my father was building an empire that employed hundreds, she was content to punch a time clock and complain about his ambitions. Emily, that's enough. The words came out harder than I intended. Is it? Because I think these people deserve to know why you're really here. She turned back to the crowd, a prosecutor addressing a jury. She took half his assets in the divorce despite contributing nothing to his success. Then she spent 14 years acting like the victim while he built something magnificent. The crowd was fully engaged now, a few heads nodding in agreement. I saw faces I recognized, former neighbors, people I'd considered friends during the marriage. None of them met my eyes. He supported her for years while she refused to grow, refused to take risks, refused to be the partner he deserved. And now that he's gone, she shows up expecting sympathy, expecting to be treated like she mattered in his life. Each word landed like a physical blow, not because they were entirely untrue, but because they reduced 20 years of marriage to a simple story of failure and blame. I thought about defending myself, explaining the complexity of what we'd shared, the love that had existed alongside the growing incompatibility. But what was the point? These people had chosen their narrative long ago. My father died building something that will outlast us all, Emily concluded, her voice rising with conviction. He deserved a wife who would have helped him reach those heights, not one who tried to drag him down to her level. The chapel fell silent. I stood there, fully exposed, feeling the weight of 150 judgmental stares. Part of me wanted to walk out, to spare myself the continued humiliation, but another part, the part that had loved Michael Bennett more than anything, refused to be driven away from his final goodbye. "Are you finished?" I asked quietly. Emily's eyes flashed with surprise. She'd expected me to crumble, to slink away in shame. When I remained standing, her confidence flickered for just a moment. "I loved your father for 34 years, I said, my voice carrying clearly through the silent chapel. 20 of them as his wife, 14 more as someone who wished him well, despite everything that went wrong between us. I'm not here to make claims or demand recognition. I'm here because once upon a time, we made promises to each other that mattered, and I choose to honor that memory." I sat back down, folding my hands in my lap. Around me, the silence stretched uncomfortably. Emily stood frozen in the aisle, apparently unprepared for resistance to her public trial. "The service will begin in 5 minutes," someone announced from the front of the chapel, probably the funeral director trying to restore order to his carefully orchestrated event. Emily shot me one final look of contempt before striding toward the front pew, reserved for family. As conversations gradually resumed, I caught fragments of continued gossip. The nerve of some people, poor Emily having to deal with this, should have stayed home. But I stayed through the eulogy that painted Michael as a visionary who'd overcome obstacles to achieve greatness, through the readings from business associates who spoke of his leadership and innovation, through the musical selections that emphasized triumph over adversity. When it ended, people filed past, offering condolences to Emily while pointedly ignoring me. I waited until the chapel had mostly emptied before standing to leave. "Ms. Mitchell." A man in an expensive suit approached, middle-aged professional carrying a leather briefcase. "James Carter from Carter and Associates. Could I have a word?" As the last hymn faded and the funeral director stepped forward with closing remarks, I felt the familiar weight of exhaustion settling over me like a heavy coat. The ordeal was nearly over. In a few minutes, I could slip out through the side door, drive home to my quiet apartment, and try to forget this entire humiliating experience. Around me, people were gathering their things, purses, programs, the subtle restlessness signaling a formal event's end. Emily stood near the front, accepting condolences with the practiced grace of someone accustomed to being the center of attention. A few people glanced my way, but most had already dismissed me as irrelevant to the day's proceedings. I was reaching for my coat when a voice stopped me. "Ms. Mitchell?" James Carter approached with measured steps, his expensive suit impeccable despite the long ceremony. Up close, he looked younger than I'd expected, maybe 45, with sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and the confident bearing of someone who'd handled wealthy clients' affairs for years. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said, extending his hand. "James Carter, Carter and Associates. We spoke briefly after the service." "Thank you." I shook his hand, noting the firm grip and direct gaze. The service was very nice. Michael would have appreciated it. Indeed, he was quite specific about his final arrangements. He paused, glancing around the emptying chapel. "I wonder if I might have a word with you and Emily. There are some matters we need to discuss regarding Mr. Bennett's estate." Before I could respond, Emily appeared at my shoulder, her expression shifting from practiced grief to alert interest. "James, finally, I was wondering when we'd handle the business side of things." "Of course, Emily. These matters require careful attention." James's voice carried the measured tone of someone accustomed to delivering important news. "I'd like both of you to come to my office for the reading of your father's will." Both of us? Emily's eyebrows rose. Is that necessary? I mean, she's not. She gestured vaguely in my direction. Your mother is specifically named in the will, Emily. Her presence is required by law. I felt a flutter of surprise. Named in the will? That seemed unlikely given everything that had passed between Michael and me. More likely, some minor formality, perhaps forgiving an old debt or confirming I had no claim to his estate. I don't think that's necessary, I said quietly. I'm sure it's just a formality. You don't need me there. James's eyes met mine directly. I'm afraid I do, Ms. Mitchell. Mr. Bennett was very specific about who should be present for the reading, and both you and Emily must be there. Something in his tone suggested this wasn't negotiable. Emily looked annoyed but shrugged with the casual confidence of someone who knew she had nothing to worry about. Fine, let's get this over with. She turned to me with barely concealed impatience. Try not to make this more difficult than it needs to be. The walk to James's office took us 4 blocks through downtown Toronto, past buildings that had watched the city's fortunes rise and fall with the real estate boom. James maintained professional small talk, comments about the weather, the turnout at the service, carefully neutral observations that revealed nothing about what awaited us. His office occupied the top floor of a renovated heritage building, all polished wood and leather-bound books, exuding established success. Certificates and diplomas lined the walls, interspersed with photos of James with local dignitaries and business leaders. It was exactly the kind of place Michael would have chosen. Prestigious, but not ostentatious. Successful, yet respectful of tradition. Please have a seat. James gestured toward 2 leather chairs in front of his oak desk. Emily claimed the chair closest to James, leaving me the one slightly to the side, which felt appropriate given my peripheral status in these proceedings. James settled behind his desk and opened a thick file folder, extracting several legal documents with the careful precision of someone who'd performed this ritual countless times. The afternoon light slanted through tall windows, illuminating dust motes that danced like tiny spirits in the suddenly quiet room. Before we begin, James said, adjusting his glasses, I want to express my condolences again. Michael was not only a valued client, but someone I considered a friend. His loss is deeply felt by everyone who knew him. Emily nodded solemnly. I remained silent, unsure what response was expected from someone whose relationship with the deceased was so complicated. James lifted the top document, several pages bound with a red backing, and cleared his throat. This is the last will and testament of Michael James Bennett, executed on April 10th, 2024, and properly witnessed according to Ontario law. The will supersedes all previous wills and codicils, only 12 months ago. I wondered what had prompted Michael to update his will so recently. Had he been sick? Had something happened that made him contemplate mortality? The will confirms that Mr. Bennett was of sound mind and disposing memory when these documents were prepared, and that he was under no undue influence or coercion. James's voice carried the formal cadence of legal proceedings, each word carefully enunciated. Emily leaned forward slightly, her hands clasped together. I could see the anticipation in her posture, a woman preparing to claim her inheritance, to step fully into the empire her father had built. James turned to the second page of the will, his reading glasses catching the afternoon light as he continued in his measured professional tone. I hereby make the following specific bequests and devises, he read, his voice steady and clear. To my beloved daughter, Emily Grace Bennett, I leave the family home at 123 Lakeshore Boulevard, along with all furnishings, artwork, and personal property contained therein. Emily smiled, a satisfied expression spreading across her face. The Lakeshore house was worth at least $1.2 million, a substantial property with lake views and enough space to entertain business associates properly. Additionally, James continued, I bequeath to Emily the sum of $700,000 to be transferred from my primary investment account within 45 days of probate. $700,000 plus the house. I watched Emily's reaction carefully, noting how her smile flickered slightly around the edges. She was pleased, certainly, but I could see her calculating in her head. $700,000 was significant money, but Michael's real estate empire was worth far more than that. Where was the rest? Where was the company? That's wonderful, of course, Emily said, her voice carrying a note of uncertainty she was trying to mask. But what about Dad's business interests? The company? James set down the first page and lifted the second, his expression remaining professionally neutral. I'm continuing with the specific bequests, Emily. Please allow me to finish reading the relevant sections. I shifted in my chair, feeling increasingly like an intruder witnessing a private family moment. $700,000 was more money than I'd seen in several lifetimes. Combined with the house, Emily was receiving an inheritance that would set her up comfortably for years. It seemed appropriate, natural even. She was Michael's daughter, his chosen successor in life, the person he'd groomed to understand his world. The bequest to Emily, James continued, includes the following conditions. The inheritance is contingent upon her continued employment with Bennett Real Estate Solutions for a minimum of 3 years following the date of this will's execution, or until such time as the company is sold or dissolved. Now Emily looked genuinely confused. Conditions? What kind of conditions? And what do you mean until the company is sold? Who would sell it? I'm reading the will as written, Emily. These are your father's words, not mine. A tension I hadn't noticed before began to creep into the room. Emily's confident posture shifted slightly, her hands unclenching and reclenching in her lap. I found myself leaning forward despite my intention to remain detached from these proceedings. Let me get this straight, Emily said, her voice taking on an edge I recognized from our confrontation at the chapel. I get the house and $700,000, but there are strings attached. And you're talking about the company being sold? That doesn't make sense. Dad would never sell the company. It was his life's work. James removed his glasses and cleaned them carefully, a gesture that seemed designed to give everyone a moment to process what they'd heard. When he replaced them, his gaze moved between Emily and me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Your father's will contains additional provisions that address the disposition of his remaining assets, he said quietly. The company, his investment portfolio, and several other significant holdings. Well then, let's hear them, Emily demanded, her patience clearly wearing thin. What are these other provisions? I watched this exchange with growing unease. Something about James's manner suggested we were approaching territory none of us were prepared for. The careful way he was parsing his words, the slightly apologetic tone creeping into his voice, reminded me of how doctors spoke when they had difficult news to deliver. Before I continue, James said, settling back in his chair, I want to emphasize that these documents represent Mr. Bennett's final considered wishes. They were prepared after extensive discussion and consultation, and he was adamant about their contents. The room fell silent except for the tick of an antique clock on James's bookshelf. Emily stared at the lawyer with growing alarm, while I found myself wondering why Michael had insisted I be present for what seemed like a straightforward family matter. James lifted the third page of the will, his eyes scanning the text briefly before looking up at both of us. However, he said, his voice carrying a weight that made my stomach tighten, the will contains provisions that fundamentally alter the distribution of Mr. Bennett's estate. James lifted his reading glasses and looked directly at me for the first time since we'd entered his office. Something in his expression made my stomach tighten, a mix of sympathy and professional obligation that suggested I was about to hear something I wasn't prepared for. However, he continued, his voice taking on additional weight, The will contains provisions for the disposition of Mr. Bennett's remaining assets, which constitute the majority of his estate. Emily leaned forward even further, her hands gripping the armrests of her chair. Finally, let's hear about the company and the rest of his investments. James returned his attention to the document, clearing his throat with the deliberate pause of someone about to deliver life-changing news. To my former wife, Sarah Marie Mitchell, he read, his words falling into the quiet office like stones into still water. I bequeath the sum of $49.3 million to be transferred from my primary investment accounts and securities portfolio. The words hung in the air like smoke from an explosion. I felt my mouth fall open, a physical reaction I couldn't control. $49.3 million. The number was so large it didn't seem real. It didn't apply to someone like me sitting in a lawyer's office in Toronto, Canada. There must be some mistake, I managed to say, my voice sounding strange and distant. Did you say 49 million? 49.3 million? Yes. James's tone remained professionally neutral, but I caught something in his eyes. Not surprise, but the careful observation of someone watching expected chaos unfold. Emily's face had gone completely white, then flushed red, as if her blood couldn't decide which direction to flow. What did you just say? Additionally, James continued reading, apparently determined to deliver the complete bombshell. I transfer to Sarah Mitchell controlling interest in Bennett Real Estate Solutions, including all subsidiary companies, real estate holdings, and business assets. This transfer includes 70% ownership of all corporate entities and appointment as chairman of the board of directors. I couldn't breathe. The room seemed to tilt sideways, as if the laws of physics had suddenly changed their minds about how the world should work. Controlling interest in Michael's company, the empire I'd watched him build from nothing, the business that had consumed our marriage, the source of wealth that had made me feel so inadequate. He was giving it all to me. This can't be right, I whispered. There has to be some error in the documentation. I assure you, Ms. Mitchell, there is no error. James removed his glasses again, cleaning them with methodical precision. These documents were prepared under Mr. Bennett's direct supervision. He reviewed every word multiple times and confirmed these were his exact wishes. Emily shot to her feet so abruptly her chair rolled backward and struck the wall. This is impossible. He wouldn't. He couldn't. She turned to stare at me with an expression of pure disbelief mixed with something darker. What did you do? How did you manipulate him? I didn't do anything, I said weakly, still trying to process the impossibility of what I'd just heard. I haven't spoken to your father in 14 years. Fraud. The word exploded from Emily like a gunshot. People don't just give away $49 million to their ex-wives for no reason. You must have gotten to him somehow, convinced him when he was sick, when he wasn't thinking clearly. James's voice cut through Emily's rising hysteria with professional authority. I can assure you that Mr. Bennett was of completely sound mind when he executed these documents. He underwent a thorough mental competency evaluation, specifically to prevent any future challenges to the will's validity. I sat frozen in my chair, watching this scene unfold as if it were happening to someone else. The numbers James had read, $49.3 million controlling interest in a multi-million-dollar company, belonged in a different universe than the one where I worried about grocery bills and car repairs. But why, I asked, the question emerging from some deep place of confusion and disbelief. Why would he do this? James gathered the will documents into a neat stack, his movements careful and deliberate. Mr. Bennett left specific instructions regarding that question, Ms. Mitchell. He asked me to share a personal message with you after reading these provisions. Emily's face contorted with rage and betrayal. A personal message? He left her a personal message but cut me out of everything that mattered? You received a substantial inheritance, Emily, James replied calmly. $700,000 and a valuable property represent more wealth than most people see in their lifetimes. Compared to what she's getting, Emily pointed at me with a shaking finger. You're talking about hundreds of millions in total assets. The company alone is worth more than everything else combined. The room pulsed with tension so thick I could taste it. Somewhere in the back of my mind, I realized my entire life had just changed in ways I couldn't begin to comprehend. But all I could focus on was the impossible fact that Michael, stubborn, ambitious Michael, who had grown to resent everything I represented, had somehow decided to give me everything he'd built. That's when Emily completely lost control. "This is fraud," she screamed, her voice cracking with rage. "Criminal fraud. He was manipulated, coerced, mentally compromised." She whirled toward me, her face twisted with fury and disbelief. "You did something to him. There's no other explanation." I shrank back in my chair, overwhelmed by the violence of her reaction. "Emily, I swear to you I had no contact with your father. I didn't even know he was sick." "Liar." She slammed her palm against James's desk, sending papers scattering. "Nobody gives away everything they've built to someone who abandoned their family, someone who couldn't even be bothered to call when he was dying." "He didn't abandon anyone," I said quietly, finding some small reserve of strength. "Our marriage ended, but that doesn't mean—" "It means exactly that." Emily's voice rose to a near shriek. "You walked away from us. You took your pathetic settlement and disappeared into your pathetic little life while he built an empire. And now you want me to believe he just decided to hand it all over to you?" James's voice cut through the chaos with professional authority. "Miss Bennett, Emily, I understand this is difficult news, but I must insist you control yourself. These are your father's clearly stated wishes, executed with full legal authority." Emily spun toward the lawyer, her eyes blazing. "I want every document examined. I want psychiatric evaluations. I want to know every single contact this woman had with my father in the past 5 years." "There were no contacts," James replied calmly. "Mr. Bennett made that very clear when he explained his decision." "Explained his decision?" Emily's laugh was bitter and sharp. "So he did explain why he decided to betray his only daughter and give everything to the woman who ruined his first marriage. He left a personal message for your mother." "Yes." The word mother seemed to hit Emily like a physical blow. For just a moment, her rage flickered, and something else showed through, a pain so deep it made my chest ache. Then the fury returned, doubled in intensity. "She's not my mother," Emily snarled. "My mother would have been there when he needed her. My mother would have supported his dreams instead of trying to drag him down." She turned back to me, her face contorted with years of accumulated resentment. "You're nothing but a failed woman who couldn't handle being married to someone better than you." Each word landed like a knife thrust, not because they were entirely false, but because they contained enough truth to draw blood. I had felt inadequate during those final years. I had struggled with Michael's success. I had been the one who couldn't adapt to the world he was creating. "Maybe you're right," I said quietly. "Maybe I wasn't the wife he deserved, but I never asked for this. I never expected this." "Expected?" Emily's voice climbed another octave. "You orchestrated this. Somehow, some way, you got to him when he was vulnerable, when he was sick or scared or—" "Enough," James interrupted, his professional patience finally showing strain. "Mr. Bennett was neither sick nor vulnerable when he made these decisions. He was, in fact, more determined and clear-minded than I'd ever seen him." "Then why?" Emily demanded, her voice breaking slightly. "Why would he do this to me? I was everything he wanted me to be. I worked for his company. I lived the life he planned for me. I became the daughter he could be proud of." The pain in her voice cut through my own shock. Despite everything, the years of hostility, the public humiliation, the bitter accusations, I saw her clearly for a moment. A woman who had spent her entire adult life trying to earn her father's approval, only to discover he'd given his ultimate validation to someone else. He left a message explaining his reasoning, James said gently. Would you like me to read it? Emily's hands were shaking now, her whole body vibrating with suppressed rage and grief. A message. He couldn't explain it to my face, but he left a message for her. The message addresses both of you, actually. It was meant to be shared after the will reading. I found my voice, though it came out hoarse and uncertain. Maybe we should hear what he had to say. Emily's eyes locked on mine with pure hatred. You have no right to make decisions here. You have no right to any of this. But even as she spoke, I could see the desperate need in her expression, the need to understand why her father had chosen to shatter everything she'd believed about her place in his world. James was already reaching for another envelope, one with personal message written across it in Michael's familiar handwriting. James raised his hand, commanding silence with the authority of someone accustomed to controlling emotional courtrooms. Enough, both of you. His voice cut through the tension like a blade. Before this goes any further, I have something that will explain everything. He opened the manila envelope with Michael's distinctive handwriting across the front, extracting several pages of cream-colored stationery. Michael knew this moment would be difficult. He asked me to read this personal message after the will was announced. Emily slumped back into her chair, her rage momentarily displaced by desperate curiosity. I remained frozen, afraid to hope for understanding, but desperate for any explanation that might make sense of this impossible situation. James cleared his throat and began reading in Michael's own words. My dearest Sarah, if you're hearing this, it means I'm gone, and you're probably sitting in James's office wondering if the entire world has lost its mind. I can picture your face, that expression you used to get when I'd rearrange the living room furniture without warning, confused, but trying to be polite about it. Despite everything, I felt my lips curve into the ghost of a smile. He'd captured that expression perfectly, and somehow hearing his voice through James's reading made him feel present in the room. I know this inheritance comes as a shock. I know you're probably thinking there's been some terrible mistake, that you don't deserve this money or this responsibility, but Sarah, you're wrong. You deserve every penny, and I'm going to tell you why. James paused, glancing up at both of us before continuing. I never stopped loving you. Not during our worst fights, not during the divorce proceedings, not during these 14 years of stubborn silence. I was angry with you for not understanding my ambitions, but I was angrier with myself for choosing those ambitions over our marriage. You tried to save us, Sarah. You begged me to find balance, to remember what mattered. I was too proud and too afraid to listen. The words hit me like physical blows. I felt tears starting, hot and unexpected, as decades of guilt and regret crystallized into this moment of impossible absolution. Emily, the message continued, and I saw my daughter's head snap up at hearing her name. My beautiful, brilliant girl. I know you're furious right now, probably convinced your mother somehow manipulated me. But sweetheart, you're not ready for this inheritance. Not yet. Emily's face went white, then red, cycling through emotions too quickly to track. You've lived your entire adult life in the shadow of my success, accepting the benefits without understanding the responsibility. You've never had to build something from nothing, never had to make the hard choices that wealth requires. More importantly, you've spent 14 years hating a good woman for crimes she never committed. That's not true, Emily whispered, but her voice lacked conviction. James continued reading. Sarah taught me about character, about integrity, about the kind of strength that doesn't need to prove itself through cruelty or judgment. I forgot those lessons when I chose money over marriage, business over love. Finally, James folded the letter carefully and placed it back in its envelope. He asked me to give this to you, Sarah. The original is yours to keep. I reached for the letter with trembling hands, holding the last conversation I would ever have with the man who had shaped my life in ways both beautiful and painful. The weight of Michael's words settled over the office like dust after an explosion. For several minutes, none of us spoke. I held his letter against my chest, feeling the physical reality of his final gift. Not just the money, but the restoration of my worth in his eyes, and more importantly, in my own. Emily was the first to break the silence. "This isn't over," she said quietly, but the fire had gone out of her voice. "I can contest this. Mental incapacity, undue influence, fraud. There are ways to challenge a will." I looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time since we'd entered James's office. I saw a woman who had spent her entire life expecting the world to bend to her wishes, who had never learned that love couldn't be inherited or demanded, only earned. "You could try," I said gently. "But your father was right, Emily. You're not ready for this responsibility." "And you are?" Her laugh was bitter, hollow. "You're a nobody, Mom." A retired factory worker with no business experience, no connections, no understanding of what it takes to run a company worth hundreds of millions. For a moment, the old Sarah, the one who had felt inadequate for 20 years, wanted to agree with her. But Michael's words echoed in my mind. "You deserve every penny." "Maybe you're right," I said, standing up slowly. "Maybe I don't know anything about running a business empire, but I know something your father valued more than business expertise." "What's that?" "I know the difference between serving others and serving myself." Emily's face twisted with a final flash of rage. "This is insane. He was sick. He was old. He wasn't thinking clearly." James's voice cut through the outburst with professional finality. "Your father was 60 years old and in perfect mental health when he executed these documents. He underwent extensive psychological evaluation specifically to prevent the kind of challenges you're threatening." "Then why?" Emily's voice cracked like a teenager's. "Why would he do this to me?" I felt a surge of unexpected compassion for this angry woman who was, despite everything, still my daughter. "He didn't do it to you, Emily. He did it for you. He gave you a chance to discover who you are when you're not living in the shadow of unlimited wealth." "I don't want that chance." The words exploded from her with the force of 14 years of entitlement and expectation. "I want what's rightfully mine." "What's rightfully yours," I said quietly, "is $700,000 and a house worth over $1 million. That's more than most people see in a lifetime. What you think you deserved was never really yours to begin with." Emily stared at me for a long moment, and I saw her realize that something fundamental had changed. The woman she'd publicly humiliated that morning, the mother she'd dismissed as a failure, was no longer asking for her approval or understanding. "You think you've won," she said, gathering her coat with shaking hands. "You think this makes you some kind of hero?" "No," I replied, and I felt the truth of it in my bones. "I think it makes me responsible." She stood at the office door for a moment, seeming smaller than when she'd entered. "This isn't finished." "Yes, it is," I said gently. "This finished the moment your father made his choice. The only question now is what you do with the life he's given you." She left without another word, the door closing behind her with a soft click that seemed to echo in the sudden quiet. James began organizing papers on his desk, the rustle of documents returning us to practical reality. There will be paperwork to complete, accounts to transfer, board meetings to schedule. The company's current management team is excellent. They can help you transition into your new role. I nodded, still processing the magnitude of what had happened. "James, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Did he really love me? Even after everything that went wrong between us?" He smiled, the first genuine smile I'd seen from him all day. "Sarah, he talked about you every time we met. Not about the divorce, not about the problems, about the woman who taught him that success without character is just expensive failure. I walked out of that office a different woman than the one who had entered. The afternoon sun felt warmer, the air cleaner. I had work to do, responsibilities to embrace, a company to learn about and improve. But for the first time in 14 years, I felt worthy of the challenge. Justice, I realized, wasn't about revenge or vindication. It was about recognition. The recognition that character matters more than credentials, that patience outlasts entitlement, and that love, real love, never truly dies. Michael had seen all of that, and in his final act, he had given me the chance to prove him right. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left. Thank you for watching.